communities and businesses. So go to the next slide. So after that, and we had worked with this framework on the state scale, the question that DEQ presented to us is, okay, let's test the scalability. Can we actually develop a systematic approach for looking at this vulnerability and in making sure we're including the equity side of the equation too? And can we use real case studies that our team had already worked with New Bern? Can we apply this to New Bern? But could it really work for New Hanover County, one of the counties where Wilmington is, that was huge impacted by a recent hurricane? Next slide. Well, fortunately, we had another stakeholder enter the team, and this was Beth Schrader, head of the Office of Recovery and Resilience at New Hanover County. And she stepped forward and said, okay, I'm willing to champion this and also represent what should be measured and how effective can we be to actually be providing these solutions. So I'm not going to read this slide, but you can see then that these topics of these energy system, emergency management, and community resilience are all being addressed. If you go to the next slide, the bottom line on this is then that there are two big things that you have to balance with one another. The vulnerability of the power system assets, that Nelson's going to be talking about from a Duke perspective, what is that energy asset vulnerability? And then the community assets that Beth was representing for New Hanover County. What is the vulnerability of the people and the infrastructure in New Hanover County to really handle this potential for power outages? And go to the next slide, which is my last slide. You can see how this all played out. This is just one sampling of some of the maps and data that were created for New Hanover County. But this is the vulnerability and risk for residential properties. And this is just one part that we looked at here, but these are the homes, right? And if you look at a map like this, the brighter red, that's more vulnerable and at risk to this type of flooding. And then there is the purple hatched areas, which are showing, in this case, households below the poverty line. So that you're not only seeing we're flooding, and recognize here that there are 3 different types of flooding in these maps, different types of storm surge, as well as flooding due to heavy precipitation. But not only, where it impacts the homes, but where it also impacts the people that have lower resources to be able to deal with it. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to the next speaker. Sushma, take it away.
Thank you. And Sushma, before you get started, I wanted to let the audience know if you have questions, we'll be doing question and answer at the end, but you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box to give speakers time to think about your questions prior to the Q&A time. Thank you. I'll let Sushma take it away.
Thank you, Commissioner Duffley. And thank you, Jim. And well, thank you to all my colleagues that are here and for inviting the EQ to present this presentation. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can forward the slides. How do we do that?
Will's going to do that for you. You just say next slide.
This is what happens when I wait too late to get the instructions right. All right, next slide, please. So for North Carolina, as you heard, our problem statement is pretty straightforward. We are probably at the front line of so many weather-related incidences and disasters, but also we have a growing, robust economy with businesses moving here, people moving here, and it's a great place to live. So our concerns are related to the frequent extreme weather events that disrupt our day-to-day lives, our business functions, our infrastructure, both built and natural, that we have learned to enjoy as a public benefit. But we also know that this continues to threaten the human public health and safety of the people of North Carolina. Next, please. And we have been at the front line of these experiences. I'll show you in a few moments a couple of slides that just shows the extent of what our shared experience has been over the last few years. For example, in 2018, Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew, both over 500-year storms hit North Carolina, and in most cases, the same counties. These storms, particularly Florence, disrupted the state for many, many days. Over 51 counties were declared disaster area, cost the state over $17 billion. Initially, many thousands of people were rescued. It required mobilization on so many sectors, including the power sector. And these are some of the statistics that Duke Energy has shared with the state. So the flooding and wind damage associated with this storm in particular was unprecedented. And we know that it's not one of a kind, that it is occurring repeatedly. Of all the grid-related disturbances that we've seen, almost 67 or almost 2/3 of it has been due to weather-related events. Next, please. Around that same time, we experienced Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Dorian in 2019, Hurricane Isaias in 2020, and Tropical Storm Fred in 2021. This just shows you the counties that were impacted at various levels on just 3 of the storms, Matthew, Michael, and Florence. 77 out of 100 counties were impacted between 2016 and 2018. And our data shows that in the last decade, the total cost to the state, CPI adjusted, ranged between $20 to $50 billion. And that's compared to the average decade cost. The prior decade was between 5 to 10 billion. And so as these costs are increasing, not only is the state and the local government looking at how do we plan and build better, but how do we recover quicker? Next, please. So in order to plan better, we decided that we needed to know what the science was telling us. In 2019 and 2020, as part of this large-scale collaborative work that we did with the state, with the academia, with the communities, we commissioned a scientific study to examine what the trend in North Carolina has been related to climate patterns. We focused on about 20 to 25 key climate variables, including those that are needed for building and engineering design of assets. The study was really revealing. It provided a downscaled information of the impact to North Carolina related to weather, temperature changes, night and daytime, but also provided a historical perspective of what we plan to see or continue to see. And the conclusion from the authors, all renowned scientists from the state and also globally as well as nationally, concluded that large changes in North Carolina's climate, much larger than any time in our state's history, are very likely with a 90 to 100% probability of outcome, are expected to be experienced by the end of this century, under both what we call the low and high greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And the chart below shows the projections of what the temperature changes are expected under the lower emission scenario. This is the what you're familiar with, achieving neutrality by 2050, or going the current pace of fossil fuel emissions under the higher emissions. But the disruptions to North Carolina in terms of temperature increases are already at 1 degree Fahrenheit and will continue to be elevated. And the severity of that, the magnitude of that elevation would depend on our mitigation actions and reductions in these emissions. Next, please. And so in 2019 and 2021, our department worked with our partners across the state and the nation to bring forth the best resources that we could get to plan better. The first was the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan that laid out a series of policy and action recommendations related to the electric power sector. It focused mainly on transitioning to the 21st century power grid, but also enabling a variety of what we call energy priorities, the value systems that we as a state value in ensuring in the grid of the future. That plan has resulted in lots of conversations across the state. And just a few months ago, last year, it led to a bipartisan energy legislation that codified the 70% carbon reduction targets from the electric power sector and reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Along with what the plan specified was a transition to a regulatory reform that concluded performance-based rate making and other mechanisms to enable that power grid of the future. So just wanted to highlight that a lot of work has gone and continues to work outside of the EQ, but more in the private sector and at the Utilities Commission. We also worked with the scientists to produce the climate risk assessment resilience plan. And here we looked at what system is vulnerable and what are the solutions, at least in the initial strategy development, that we can focus on. For the power grid system and the electricity sector, we basically identified a variety of solutions related to distributed energy resources, microgrids, and community-based resilience planning. Next, please. The three areas that our department has really focused is 3 recommendations in the Clean Energy Plan. And I'll just walk through it so that it forms a lot of what Dr. Cox and others will talk about. The first is we recognize as a stakeholder community that a comprehensive utility system planning is an important aspect to our future grid. And as part of the NERC task force that North Carolina participated in, and the conversations we had and a variety of technical conferences and discussions our commission has had, it all points towards an integrated system that allows the planning at the generation, transmission, and distribution to be done in a holistic and iterative fashion that creates a transparent process for not only the utility planners, but also the consuming public and the decision makers. The second was to modernize the grid that would actually support the clean energy resources of the future. This just meant that creating a transparent accountability structure, setting targets for what we're after and how we're achieving them, setting timelines and metrics of progress towards those grid modernization goals, so that the investments in those infrastructure through ratepayer-based funds would result in benefits to the community. And then finally, we looked at strengthening the resilience and flexibility of the grid. This would require investing, but also understanding the pros and cons of DERs, community solutions, and microgrids at critical infrastructure locations to enhance resiliency. And then finally, as you'll hear from Dr. Cox, prioritizing what the human costs of power outages are, and how do we use those cost estimates or techniques to evaluate the grid modernization plan related to resiliency. Next, please. And so as part, this is a snapshot of the work that we did with the NERC task force. North Carolina built a case study. One of the questions we asked was, how does the resilient distribution planning align with our current transmission and resource planning? What role do these components play, and what stages do we set our goals and expectations? This is an ongoing conversation in North Carolina, and Commissioner Duffley knows very well where we are with our IOUs and the plans that are being discussed in the future dockets. Next, please. And I'll shift over to the resilience plan. This was an integrated multi-sector plan. It looked at a variety of things. We applied the climate resilience toolkit methodology. It brought in state and local officials from all sectors, from the agricultural sector, coastal resources, our commerce department, cultural resources, as well as ecosystem enhancement, housing and buildings, DHHS, which is our health and human services, our public safety folks that support the police and the prison systems and a variety of services at state, transportation, and energy. All of these sectors were evaluated in terms of what is vulnerable and what is at risk. And as a result of that, we put this plan together that contains a matrix of vulnerabilities and risks, but also some initial solutions that we can focus on. Next, please. And so at the end of the day, our vision of resilience is a North Carolina where our communities and our ecosystem and environment, as well as our economy, are better able to rebound and can positively adapt and thrive so that we can maintain and improve our quality of life. Most of all, we want to preserve our natural resources and environment that makes our state a great place to live and work. Next, please. So, and we're now focusing on a variety of projects related to community energy resilience. We're creating a decision support tool that looks at mapping, but as well as on the ground information. We're looking at data and assets that are available, along with the stressors, the climate stressors, as well as non-climate stressors that are imposing in a given area, let's say a town or municipality or a community, and how that community's critical infrastructure is disrupted or maintained or not maintained. And through these prioritizations, our team is working with our partners to bring projects and actions so that they can actually solve these issues and work with federal agencies to support funding them. Next, please. And this is just for your information. I've listed 6 projects here that are either underway or completed. We're happy to provide information on this. It'll be on our website. The next slide also includes 3 more projects that are focusing on resiliency as well as infrastructure assurance related matters. There's one new project that we're working on, and that looks at microgrids feasibility assessment at critical infrastructures and other community locations. So I'll stop there and thank you so much.
Thank you, Shushma. We'll next hear from Robert Cox.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Yeah, and again, thanks to all my colleagues on this panel here. The project that I will talk about here is one of the ones that Sushma mentioned there in our last 2 slides. The title is Planning an Affordable, Resilient, and Sustainable Grid in North Carolina, or the PARS-G project, as we have called it. And you can see here on the bottom of the slide, it's a partnership across a number of different entities within the state of North Carolina. The North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, which Sushma is a part of, is the prime recipient of the award from the Department of Energy through their competitive award program, through their state energy program. And this work has been done in partnership with my colleagues at the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, which is part of NC State University, and my team at UNC Charlotte, which has been doing a lot of the technical assessment at what we call the Energy Production and Infrastructure Center, or EPIC. So we've been pleased to be a part of this overall project that I kind of wanted to give you an understanding of here today. Next slide, please. This project started back in, we proposed it, I guess, very early in 2018. And actually Duke Energy was a partner in the process of scoping that project because there was a lot going on at the time, things that many of you are probably aware of. But at the time, Duke Energy had a $13 billion grid modernization effort that was in the public domain at that time being discussed. And one of the big questions that we looked at from a technical perspective was, okay, we had just seen, as Sushma talked about, a number of storms that had come through in recent years, one of them being Hurricane Florence. And you know, we saw some very significant impacts from Florence in particular, but also that just increasing sort of storm activity. And there was a lot of questions about the value of grid modernization and how do you really value resiliency in the regulatory process. And so our team really said, you know, in a lot of ways, it's like insurance, right? I mean, how do you begin to value the cost that you need to put in to be able to offset potentially the cost that you may have to pay later? So that was the backdrop of our thinking. And we basically had 2 guiding questions when we put the research program together. Those questions are listed there. So the first, you know, what are the consequences of recent and expected events? And the framework that we use is based on a framework that DOE has talked about in the past. They're what they call their resilience assessment process, RAP. Essentially what we look at is, if you go across the bottom of that chart, basically we talk about a different hazard that might happen. So a hurricane, for instance, we look at how that's impacted in the past grid operations. And ultimately, what does that do to the power that's delivered? And then ultimately, what's the consequences of that power loss? When we say consequences, we're really talking about indirect consequences. What's the impact to society? What's the impact to the economy? Can we begin to quantify that and think about that? Now, I recognize that's not something of a regulatory art at the moment, but that is something that our team is thinking about. You need to probably, you can't divorce those two things because of the significance that electric power has and just the basic functioning of our society. So we wanted to understand those consequences. And then this sort of top piece there talks about the second question is, how do we look at both traditional and advanced investments like DERs through the lens of mitigating those consequences? That's what our project was all about. So next slide. One of the things that I mentioned, Duke was involved. Duke was involved to the extent that they provided us a lot of data. They weren't really involved in the project itself, but allowed us to understand a number of things about what was happening in North Carolina when these major events came through. And there's a number of findings, but three key ones that I really look at here are summarized. The first one is that if you look at the past storm events that impact our North Carolina, what we see is a lot of things that impact our distribution system. And I think a lot of people don't understand in North Carolina here and throughout the Southeast, we have a largely overhead distribution system. And oftentimes the issues that customers talk about are things that are potentially outside of the utility's control. So a tree falls next to someone's house and affects a line that's coming into their home. They have a power outage, but sometimes some of the tree trimming and things like that actually fall on the customer. So we've tried to really understand a lot of what's causing a lot of these impacts. And we see a ton of those sorts of things in major events like Hurricane Florence. One of the things we found is a need for greater engagement between local stakeholders and utilities. And I think this is something that will be a major outcome for our project is what utilities see as priorities, what local stakeholders see as priorities. Sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect. And I think we're beginning to see a much greater engagement between those folks to really understand, what's critical for electric power. And I'll give you some examples as I go through here in the rest of my slides. But the third piece is this idea to think about new metrics that recognize the shared need for hardening in DERs. One of the things, I think we find here in North Carolina, as I said, we have a largely overhead distribution system. And so it's hard to just start talking about microgrids as a one-size-fits-all solution. Those work for individual buildings when you have an overhead distribution system, but don't necessarily work when you're looking at that overhead system. So we need to look at this value of how do you value, I guess, the necessity of hardening to be able to enable DERs. And then this idea of talking about either rate basing or maybe more specifically cost sharing means to get more resilient and considering the full stack benefits. I'm going to give an example of that. So I go to the next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to do is, as I said, a guiding question for us was to look at the consequences. And so we tried to look at sort of what I would call sort of the holistic benefits of grid resilience. And the map that I have here is a map of census blocks in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is on the coast. And what we're looking at each of those census blocks is a social vulnerability index. So anywhere where it's a very dark orange, we have a social vulnerability index that is close to 1. Now that is a number that's generated by the CDC, which looks at basically 4 different categories. But suffice it to say, an area with a social vulnerability index very close to 1 is an area where we have a relatively high low to moderate income community, and you have usually very limited mobility, meaning that if a storm comes through, people are going to remain in those areas typically, and a lot of costs are going into those areas. People are there, and there's a lot of payouts that are going into that area because of the people losing power. Next slide. So to try to quantify some of the benefits of grid resilience, one of the things that we looked at was to say, well, what happens if you had a shelter in one of those socially vulnerable communities, which could have resilient backup power that could be used for typical storm events in North Carolina? So a typical storm event might be something that comes through with a 2-day outage, and maybe that happens almost about once a year in certain areas. So what we looked at is okay, could we value the holistic benefits of that sort of thing? And we essentially went in and looked at how much had been paid out, say, from past storm events for what we call DSNAP benefits, which are paying out for food that's damaged, and how much is being paid out for sheltering costs. And so what we said is, well, what happens if you had this facility in this community that would allow people to stay in their homes, but could be used as sort of a feeding center and to provide services to that community, what we call an outpost, I guess. We said, we assume that this outpost could protect 100 customers with a family of 4, could provide ice to those customers so they could keep their food and allow them to stay at home. If we calculate the total cost savings that could potentially come from that, what we come out with is the numbers that you have here, about $92,000 per event, and over 20 years, about $1.85 million. So what we were looking at is how do we begin to think about the overall sort of cost benefits that could come from having power at that one location in that neighborhood that allows people to stay at home. And there's a number of things that you can begin to look at. You can talk about critical services still provided and the benefits of having those things turned on. But these are the sorts of things that in talking to the community, we've been able to kind of understand where's the money going after the storm, and how potentially could some investment in grid resiliency help to have some benefits in reducing some of those costs after the storm. So with that, I think that's sort of a quick summary. There's a lot of details of ours, but I will hand it to my colleague at Nelson to talk a little bit further about what's going on at Duke.
Yeah,
Thanks, Dr. Cox. And I really enjoyed hearing a takeaway that I received from you is alignment of interest, that's so important. And sorry to interrupt, Nelson, you go ahead.
No interruption. Thank you, Commissioner, and thanks, Dr. Cox, and the other speakers for setting this up. So you can go ahead to the next slide, please. I do want to talk mostly about some of the actions that Duke Energy's taken in North Carolina as we've worked with the folks at the different groups on this panel and others across the state to learn, how we can be more resilient. But I want to start off with really more of a national look here to kind of give some perspective on the importance of resiliency. And I've got some excerpts here that really come from NERC's seasonal reliability assessment. NERC does a winter reliability assessment every year. And, some of their findings, and just to show how well they align with what we've heard already on this call. Extreme weather events, extended durations of colder than normal weather, disruptions of infrastructure, drought, other issues like that are coming from these changes that we're seeing from big weather events. And these have created, certainly highlights in the news from across the country from extreme events, and mostly in other states, fortunately for us, but we're not immune to these, and we need to take these as lessons. So we try to use this, these other events and other weather conditions in other areas to learn from and build our resilience. But I would just, say this list of findings here, to me, it just demonstrates the clear importance of a resilient power system to, to meet customer needs and protect customers in vulnerable areas. So next slide, please. So talk a little bit about, I'll start with, where Duke is on some of this. And I'll start with, our preparedness for extreme weather, and really with a focus on resiliency. Based on, lessons we've learned from other areas, certainly lessons we've learned from our own storms and situations in North Carolina. We do have very disciplined practices around preparing for both winter and summer weatherization programs, pre-season preparation. We have, the importance of diverse fuel supplies, backup fuels, integration of gas and electric, very important for fuel supplies. That became a big topic in the news and in the reports after the events in Texas last year. Certainly learning from, not only what we see in our territory, but from others. And I think, Sushma hit on this a little bit, but we see real value in, the integrated planning and operations of the generation, transmission, and distribution systems, which, we have here in North Carolina with, oversight certainly from the Utilities Commission to make sure it's done in a reliable and affordable manner. So I think, one point I would make is I think that importance of that integrated planning and operations just gets emphasized as we go forward. To really have the best opportunity for resiliency, they need to be considered together. And then I'll touch on this graph just quickly to, again, demonstrate why it's important to plan for resiliency. As we grow with more renewable energy, particularly this example is solar, it's a very good resource. It's clean, it's affordable. It's definitely in our path to the future, but it also varies quite a bit. And so you can see here just in a week's time period that how variable the output of a day of solar is during a winter day. So it's very important that we plan the system, the T&D system, the generation system accordingly, so that it can be flexible and resilient, not only to major weather events, but also to the variability of the weather. Next slide, please. So I think Sushma, I think I've got some of the same pictures you do from one of the hurricanes here, but I do want to speak to a little bit to the pictures here, and particularly around the importance of adjusting the design and implementation on our T&D systems to match up with where we see weather events and other impacts changing on us. So this picture here at the top, that's Grifton substation after Hurricane Matthew, or maybe during Hurricane Matthew, I guess, shortly thereafter. You can see the flooding, an area that had not had this type of flooding in the past, but caused significant damage, extended outages to make those repairs to the equipment that was damaged by water. As we, began to take action around how to harden our system, we targeted key areas like substations because they affect, communities. They create long outages if they're interrupted. And you see in 2018 during Florence, a temporary measure to protect that substation with some portable dams that can be used to protect equipment. And then in the bottom, a long-term solution, an actual flood wall to protect this equipment. These are the types of hardening and targeted solutions that we're trying to implement, again, to protect specific communities, specific areas, and address very, very real specific concerns. The hardening and resiliency here is very important. While it can't prevent all outages, it certainly gives us the ability to recover more quickly, as it was talked about by several of the other speakers. Next slide, please. And I'll talk more about the distribution system as well. And that, as Dr. Cox really talked about, the distribution system is, the closer to the customers. It's that last mile to the customer. It's also the, where we might have, distributed renewables connected to a distribution system, or where we might have some form of microgrid. And so adding resiliency into that system is very important. The upstream systems, the transmission system, the larger bulk power systems are more resilient and more redundant than the distribution system typically. So some key steps we've taken to increase resiliency. I'll start with the self-optimizing grid. Really, that's a great mechanism that it allows the system to identify where it's faulted and reconfigure itself to restore power more quickly in an automated manner. So this saves significant amounts of outage time for customers. It's valuable during extreme weather, but it's valuable during even normal conditions. Targeted undergrounding. Dr. Cox mentioned a lot of the distribution system is overhead, and it's probably not cost effective to go after the entire system for undergrounding or practical, but there are key places where undergrounding makes some sense from a resilience and a reliability standpoint. So we've got some active programs to attack those areas, very specific, no prone outage areas, areas of high risk for some of these events. It is a good decision to attack those from an undergrounding standpoint. And then the long duration, high impact sites, again, I think this lines up very well with what each of the previous speakers talked about, which is identifying some of those, areas that are repeatedly impacted by these types of events or that are most vulnerable, and creating some very specific solutions to those. We've got solutions that include some of these other tools. It might be undergrounding, it might be self-optimizing grid, it might be some redundancy. It certainly could be some of the other solutions talked about here with microgrids or other. And then the last one on here really is more of an enabler for more distributed renewables, an integrated volt-var system that actually allows us to manage the power flows on the distribution system more effectively as we see more distributed renewables connected to it. But the short, my conclusion, I guess, is that we definitely see the need for the grid hardening, for the increased resilience of the overall power system, while at the same time continuing to focus on the importance of not just reliability and a clean energy system, but also an affordable system, because that's very important as well to the communities that we're talking about serving here. And with that, I will conclude my remarks, Commissioner Duffley, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Nelson. And I was so impressed with the Tiger dams. And for those of you on the call that are not familiar with the Tiger Dam, it is like an inflatable donut that they put around the substation. And it's just that type of ingenuity and innovative thinking between strong weather events is what we really need right now until we build those permanent walls, or to determine whether or not those permanent walls are cost effective or not or Tiger dams are the best option. So thank you for explaining that. I really enjoyed hearing that. So we do have one question in the chat. I will ask that and then we'll get to some other general questions. And it is for you, Mr. Peeler. Has Duke Energy considered battery and other energy storage systems for this analysis? You emphasize that integrating various energy types helps build resilience. However, we will need to use mainly sustainable energy sources. How can we store renewable energy so that we can focus on an integrated, resilient electric system while taking action to minimize additional contribution to greenhouse gases?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And I did not emphasize storage, but storage certainly is a key element as we move forward. In different, whatever mechanism it ends up being. We talk a lot about, when we say storage, most folks think of large lithium-ion batteries. We certainly are installing some of those, learning about their operation. And, again, they will eventually become more cost-effective. They're not particularly cost-effective today. However, as things continue to evolve, no question that storage is going to be a key component. I would mention that, we are fortunate here in the Carolinas that we do have a significant amount of pump storage capability, which really serves, the same kind of function, but on a much larger scale. So we're definitely very engaged in how to effectively, affordably utilize storage. So no question about it.
Okay, and the next question is to the whole group, it sounds like. Has Duke or the state of North Carolina considered changing its policy with respect to vegetation management to reduce distribution outages? For example, a policy that requires customers to share in the liability of the customer's tree falling on the utility's overhead facilities, similar to the approach a utility takes when a customer digs into and damages underground facilities, should result in better choices of tree planting over time. Anyone want to take it?
I mean, I can start. Certainly, we've not, to date, don't have any action or plan to go down that route if it's just a normal type situation. Certainly if someone cuts a tree on a line or creates, actively causes the problem, we do. But that would be a very difficult path, I think, here in North Carolina to pursue. I don't know, Commissioner, if you have any thoughts, but it's really not on it's not on our list of actions at the moment.
Robert, it looks like Jim, you want to chime in?
Yeah, we've worked with a lot of cities across the Southeast, and there's this kind of unintended consequence for trimming a lot of trees, and that's due to not thinking about kind of urban heat stress, that our trees provide valuable shade and cooling. And we have, a big problem during the summer with the heat. And so if you cut too many trees, you increase your urban heat effect, which is then going to be impacting people as well too. So you have to be a little bit careful about how you balance all these different things, the larger system.
Thank you. And Robert?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think one of the big findings I know that I talked about, one of our first findings was, what do distribution outages look like in North Carolina? And I think the majority of customers, this is a big issue, I don't know how to solve it, but the majority of customers don't understand that a lot of outages happen because of trees that are outside of the right of way. It's just, why didn't Duke cut those trees? That's what, when I talk to folks, I'm not a utility person, so I guess I can say that, but I hear that, well, they're just not cutting the trees down enough. And particularly, in some of the low income areas that we closely studied in New Hanover County, we found a lot of the outages that people were saying, well, we were out for 2 weeks in Hurricane Florence. A lot of those outages were caused by tree trimming in their own yards and things like that. I don't think, things that were not recognized, that were not a utility function, but maybe more of a customer function. And I think that's an interesting opportunity. I don't know exactly how to address that, but it is an issue that I think there is kind of a shared burden, although I think in particular, there's not an understanding of that, which was kind of an interesting takeaway for me as we went through our analysis and our findings was how much of an issue that is, particularly as you get to the end of the line, where you're farthest away from a substation. There's a lot of trees down in older neighborhoods and long duration outages. This is an issue, and this is what's floated as a controversial solution in that question. But it's just understanding for customers. I don't think they understand that is a major source of a lot of these long-term outages.
I'll just add real quickly to what Dr. Cox said. He's exactly right. A significant amount of vegetation outages are from trees that are outside of right-of-ways, and either for whatever reason, they're weak or diseased, or they just don't survive significant winds. But it's a difficult balance to cut the right amount for reliability while at the same time protecting the tree canopy and everything else. So it's a great question, but it's a challenging resolution.
Shushma, anything to add to the discussion?
Just the scale of it. I think in North Carolina, we love our trees, but we pay for the price for it when the storm comes. The only thing I'd like to add is, at least in the residential areas where this could be applied, most new residential areas have underground electric wires going through. The mostly that I see, at least in the urban areas, are where the trees are not maintained either from private property or public right of way. And it's really more the cascading effect of one area that has so many units connected to it that we see the larger outages. But I must say, the experience has really, last couple of years has improved the power coming back quicker. We hear that a lot. And I think it's due to Duke Energy's implementation of some of the response systems they put in.
Thank you. I was going to do a lightning round, but it looks like we might even not have time for a lightning round. I would like to thank all of our panelists today. I'll mention to those states that are interested in incorporating resilience planning in their state, please reach out to Jim Fox, as well as Robert Cox and Shushma and even Nelson Peeler, to see how the state of North Carolina has been working on these issues. And I feel like we're a leader in these issues, and we have moved the ball forward. So please do reach out to them. And also I would recommend the Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. Shushma Mazemore talked about that plan. It's a short, you can find a short version of the plan. I'd encourage all to read that plan. And I think it was issued in 2020, and there's probably an update coming out soon. And with that, is there anything else that any of our speakers would like to add? Well, I'll turn it back to Will.
Thank you, Commissioner. This will conclude our panel presentation, and I would just like to thank all of our speakers and Commissioner Duffley for helping to moderate this discussion. So thank you all, and as mentioned, please, if any of our audience members has any follow-up questions, we'd be happy to help get you some answers. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.